Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. Glass exploded against the marble floor, the sharp, crystalline sound severing the murmurs of the elite crowd like a guillotine dropping on a neck. You are useless. You are absolutely hollow, Julian. You're just like a beta. The shout didn't just echo. It tore through the suffocating, perfume-laden air of the Imperial Gala, instantly silencing the 300 guests in attendance. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes. Predatory alphas, preening omegas, and invisible betas alike, locked onto the center of the ballroom. There, beneath the cascading light of a chandelier that cost more than a city block, stood Julian Vane. He was frozen, a flute of champagne dripping from his fingers onto his pristine white suit, staining the fabric like a wound. Towering over him, face flushed with wine and unbridled rage, was his fiancé, Lord Cassian Thorne. The insult hung in the air, heavier than the pheromones that saturated the room. In this world, where biology dictated destiny, calling a high-born omega a beta was not merely an insult to their rank. It was a declaration that they were defective, broken, worthless. Julian felt the blood drain from his face, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could feel the collective judgment of the crowd pressing against his skin, a physical weight that threatened to crush him. He was an omega of the prestigious House Vane, yet he had always been different. While others bloomed with scents of sweet lavender, citrus, or heavy musk, Julian was scentless, a null. To his fiancée, the heir of the powerful Thorne dynasty, this lack of olfactory submission was a constant source of frustration, a mirror reflecting Cassian's own insecurities. But to scream it here? To strip Julian naked of his dignity before the Emperor's court? Look at you, Cassian sneered, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss that carried through the silence. He stepped closer, his heavy pheromones, burnt oak and aggressive spice, rolling off him in waves designed to force submission. You don't react. You don't flinch. You stand there like a statue. I needed an omega to bear my airs and boost my standing, but I got a defective doll instead. Julian's fingers curled into his palms, nails digging into the flesh until it stung. He wanted to speak, to defend the quiet dignity he had spent 24 years cultivating, but his throat felt paralyzed. The social conditioning of an omega whispered to him to kneel, to apologize, to de-escalate the alpha's rage. But the freezing cold shock kept him upright. Cassian, you're drunk, Julian whispered, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. Please, not here. Don't tell me what to do, Cassian roared, raising a hand. The crowd gasped. Flinching was instinctual, but Julian didn't move. He stared into the eyes of the man he was scheduled to marry in 3 days, and in that split second, the illusion of duty shattered. Before Cassian's hand could descend, a shadow detached itself from the periphery of the room. The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. A pressure, far darker and more terrifying than Cassian's drunken posturing, flooded the hall. It smelled of ozone, cold steel, and the deep, terrifying silence of a thunderstorm before the strike. That is quite enough, Lord Thorne. The voice was a low baritone, smooth as velvet wrapped around a dagger. Cassian froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. His eyes widened, the drunken rage instantly replaced by a primal fear. He turned slowly, as did Julian. Standing there, dressed in the pitch-black military regalia of the Grand Marshal, was Duke Silas Kalen, the Viper of the North, the only prime alpha the Empire had produced in a century. He stood a full head taller than Cassian. His silver hair swept back from a face that was devastatingly handsome and utterly cruel. His eyes, the color of frozen amethysts, bored into Cassian with the indifference of a god looking at an insect. Grand Marshal, Cassian stammered, his pheromones souring with fear. This is a private matter. You made it public the moment you shattered the Emperor's crystal, Silas said, stepping forward. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, terrified of brushing against his aura. Silas stopped beside Julian, not looking at the Omega, but positioning his body between Julian and Cashin. "And I find your noise distasteful." Julian looked up at the man who had just intervened. Silas Kalin was a legend and a nightmare. It was said his pheromones were so potent they could force an entire room of alphas to their knees without him lifting a finger. Yet, standing this close, Julian felt nothing. No crushing weight. No urge to submit. Just the cool, crisp scent of rain on stone. Silas glanced down, his sharp eyes locking onto Julian's. For a microsecond, a flicker of surprise passed through the Grand Marshal's gaze. He leaned in, invading Julian's personal space, inhaling sharply near the junction of Julian's neck and shoulder. The room held its breath. Was the viper going to steal the prey? Silas pulled back, a cryptic, terrifying smile touching his lips. "Clean up this mess, Thorn, or I will have you removed." Without waiting for a response, Silas turned on his heel and walked away, the black cape of his uniform swirling around him. The intervention was brief, but the damage was done. Cashin had been humiliated by a superior predator. And Julian had been seen. The carriage ride home was silent, a silence more violent than the shouting had been. Cashin refused to look at Julian, staring out the window at the passing neon lights of the capital city, Neo Viridia. Julian sat rigid, his hands folded in his lap, the stain on his suit drying sticky and cold. When they arrived at the Thorn estate, Cashin stormed out without a word, leaving Julian to be escorted by the house staff. Julian retreated to his quarters, the gilded cage he had inhabited for the 6 months of their betrothal. He stripped off the ruined suit, standing before the mirror in his underclothes. He looked at his reflection, pale skin, slender frame, wide eyes. He looked like an Omega. He had the biology of an Omega, but the gland at the nape of his neck was dormant. "Just like a beta," he whispered to the reflection. The words cut deep because they echoed his father's disappointment. House Vane was failing. They needed a strong alliance. Julian was sold to House Thorn to save his family from bankruptcy. His defect was a secret that Cashin had discovered only after the contract was signed. A knock at the door made him flinch. "Enter," Julian said, wrapping a silk robe around himself. Cashin entered. He had shed his formal coat and loosened his tie. The smell of whiskey was pungent on his breath. The fear he had shown before the Grand Marshal was gone, replaced by a simmering, resentful aggression. "You embarrassed me," Cashin said, closing the door and locking it. "I stood still," Julian corrected, turning to face him. "You were the one shouting. Because you are maddening." Cashin paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "Do you know what they say? They whisper that I bought a broken toy, that I can't even make my own Omega submit because he's too stupid to register the command. It's biology, Cashin, not stupidity. It's a defect." Cashin lunged, grabbing Julian by the shoulders and slamming him against the wall. Julian gasped, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Cashin buried his face in Julian's neck, teeth scraping against the scent gland that offered nothing. "I should be able to smell you. I should be able to drown in you. But there's nothing. Just air." "Let me go," Julian said, his voice hard. "Or what?" Cashin pulled back, his eyes dark. "You're mine. Defective or not, the wedding is in 3 days. And once you're my husband, I will find a way to fix you. Doctors say the gland can be stimulated with enough pressure." The threat was implicit and horrifying. Julian shoved Cashin, utilizing the element of surprise. Cashin stumbled back, laughing darkly. "Feisty tonight. Good. Keep that energy for the wedding night." Cashin straightened his shirt, sneering. "Get some sleep, beta. Tomorrow we dine with the Emperor. Try not to exist too loudly." As the door clicked shut, Julian slid down the wall, burying his face in his knees. He couldn't do this. He couldn't marry a man who viewed him as a medical experiment. But where could he go? He was a null Omega with no money and a family that had sold him. He closed his eyes, and strangely, The only thing that brought him comfort was the memory of cold ozone and rain, the scent of the man who had saved him. The next day, the imperial capital was buzzing with gossip. The incident at the gala was front-page news on every datapad. Thorn air cracks under pressure, one headline read. The scentless vein, read another. Julian was summoned to the imperial palace not by his fiancée, but by a royal decree. The emperor was hosting a private luncheon for the high families, and attendance was mandatory. Julian dressed in deep sapphire velvet, a color that accentuated his pale features. He arrived at the palace alone, Cassian having sent a message that he would meet him there. As he walked through the sprawling palace gardens, trying to steel his nerves before entering the lion's den, he sought a moment of peace near the koi ponds. You wear that color well. Julian spun around. Sitting on a stone bench beneath a weeping willow, smoking a thin, aromatic cigarette, was Grand Marshal Silas Kalen. In the daylight, Silas was even more imposing. His uniform was impeccable, his posture relaxed yet ready to strike. He watched Julian with intense, unreadable eyes. Lord Kalen, Julian bowed stiffly. I didn't realize this area was occupied. It's not. I occupy where I choose, Silas said, tapping ash into a tray. Come. Sit. It wasn't a request. Julian hesitated, then approached, sitting on the far end of the bench. The silence stretched, but unlike the silence with Cassian, this wasn't heavy. It was observant. Why did you help me last night? Julian asked, breaking the quiet. I didn't help you. I silenced a barking dog, Silas replied smoothly. He turned his head, looking at Julian. Tell me, Julian Vane, do you know why I am called the Viper? Because you strike before your enemy knows they are in danger. Julian recited the common knowledge. Partially. It is also because my pheromones are toxic. Silas took a drag of his cigarette. To most omegas and even betas, my presence in a confined space induces panic attacks, fainting, and extreme distress. I am an ultra-alpha. My biology is too aggressive for polite society. Julian blinked. He realized then why the crowd had parted so terrified the night before. But I don't feel anything. Exactly, Silas murmured, smoke curling from his lips. He shifted, sliding closer on the bench. I tested you last night. I flooded your personal space with enough dominance to make a grown man weep. You merely looked at me. I am a null, Julian said, looking down at his hands. I am defective. Defective. Silas laughed, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in Julian's chest. Is a shield defective because it does not break under a hammer? You are not defective, Julian. You are immune. Silas reached out, his gloved hand tilting Julian's chin up. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through Julian that had nothing to do with pheromones and everything to do with the man himself. Do you have any idea how rare you are? Silas's voice dropped to a whisper. A partner who can stand beside me without suffocating? A partner I don't have to constantly restrain myself around. Julian's breath hitched. Partner. Cassian Thorne is a fool, Silas said, his thumb brushing Julian's lower lip. He sees a glass that won't fill. I see a fortress that cannot be breached. He plans to fix me, Julian confessed, the fear spilling out. After the wedding. Silas's eyes narrowed, the violet hue darkening. There will be no wedding. It's a binding contract. My family. I can buy your family's debt with the loose change in my coat pocket, Silas dismissed. The question is, Julian, do you want to be saved? Or do you enjoy the role of the martyr? It was a challenge. Julian looked into the eyes of the most dangerous man in the empire. He saw no pity there, only a fierce, demanding respect. I want to live, Julian whispered. I want to be someone. Then tonight, Silas said, standing up and offering his hand. You will have to be brave. Can you do that? Julian looked at the gloved hand. Taking it meant treason against his fiancée. It meant social suicide. It meant walking into the fire. He placed his hand in Silas's. Yes. The emperor's luncheon was a lavish affair held in the sunroom, a massive glass dome overlooking the city. The tables were laden with exotic delicacies, but Julian tasted nothing. He sat beside Cassian, who was on his best behavior, playing the doting fiancé for the emperor's benefit. Across the table sat Silas, engaged in quiet conversation with a general. He ignored Julian completely, which somehow made Julian more nervous. So, the emperor spoke, a jovial man with eyes like flint. The wedding is in 2 days, Lord Thorn? I trust the preparations are complete. Yes, your majesty, Cassian beamed, gripping Julian's hand under the table hard enough to bruise. We are eager to unite our houses. Excellent. House Vane has a long history. The emperor nodded to Julian. Though I hear there have been complications regarding the lineage, Cassian stiffened. Nothing we cannot handle, sire. Julian is blooming late, but with the right guidance, he will be a perfect Omega. He is not a project to be completed, Thorn. The room went deadly silent. Silas had spoken without looking up from his wine glass. Cassian's smile twitched. Excuse me, Grand Marshal? Silas set his glass down. The sound of crystal on would rang out like a gunshot. He looked up, his gaze heavy and bored. I said, he is not a project. And he certainly won't be blooming for you. Cassian stood up, his chair scraping loudly. You overstep, Duke Kalen. This is my betrothed. Is he? Silas stood slowly. As he rose, the air in the room thickened. The guards by the door shifted uneasily. The other guests began to look pale. Silas was releasing his scent intentionally. Your Majesty, Silas addressed the emperor, ignoring Cassian. I invoke the right of challenge. Gasps erupted around the table. The right of challenge was an ancient, barbaric law, rarely used in the modern era. It allowed a high-ranking alpha to challenge another for the hand of an unbonded Omega if they believed the current match was detrimental to the Omega's welfare. On what grounds? The emperor asked, intrigued rather than appalled. On the grounds of incompatibility and intended cruelty, Silas stated calmly. He pointed a gloved finger at Cassian. This man intends to torture the boy to force a biological response that isn't there. However, I find him perfect as he is. This is insane, Cassian shouted, his control snapping. You can't just take him. He's a null. He's worthless to a prime like you. And yet, Silas stepped around the table, moving toward Julian. The pressure in the room was now immense. Guests were wheezing, loosening their collars. The emperor himself looked uncomfortable. Cassian was sweating profusely, his knees shaking under the biological assault of Silas's pheromones. But Julian sat perfectly still. He breathed easily. He watched Silas approach like a storm front, beautiful and terrifying. Stand, Julian, Silas commanded softly. Julian stood. Tell them, Silas said, his eyes locked on Julian's. Does my presence hurt you? No, Julian said clearly. Does it frighten you? No. Silas turned to the gasping room. You see? He is the only one in this empire who can stand by my side without breaking. He is my equal. My mate. Cassian roared, a sound of pure humiliation, and drew the ceremonial dagger at his hip. I will kill you before I let you take what is mine. He lunged not at Silas, but at Julian, aiming to destroy the prize he couldn't keep. Time seemed to slow. Julian saw the blade glint, but before he could flinch, a black blur moved. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Cassian screamed, dropping the knife. Silas had caught Cassian's wrist in one hand and twisted it with effortless, brutal efficiency. With his other hand, Silas grabbed Cassian by the throat and lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. You called him a beta, Silas whispered, his voice a low growl that vibrated the glass walls. You called him weak, yet here you are, dangling like a child, while he stands unafraid. Silas threw Cassian across the room. The heir of House Thorn crashed into a serving table, collapsing in a heap of broken china and spilled wine. Silas turned to Julian, extending his hand once more. The room was silent, save for Cassion's whimpers. "The contract is void," Silas declared to the Emperor. "I assume House Thorn will agree to dissolve it in exchange for their heir retaining his life?" The Emperor, looking between the unconscious Cassion and the terrifying Grand Marshal, nodded slowly. "I believe that would be wise." Silas looked at Julian. The terrifying mask slipped, revealing a depth of warmth reserved only for him. "Let's go home, Julian." Julian looked at the opulent cage of the palace, at the fiancé who had tormented him, and then at the man who looked at him as if he were the rarest thing in the universe. He took Silas's hand. "Yes," Julian said, a smile breaking across his face for the first time in years. "Let's go home." Epilogue. 3 months later, the northern estate of the Kalen family was a fortress of black stone and glass, nestled in the snowy peaks. It was a place of harsh beauty, much like its master. Julian stood on the balcony, wrapped in a thick fur coat, watching the aurora borealis dance across the sky. He felt strong here. He had learned that his null state was actually a genetic evolution, a resistance that made him invaluable in Silas's diplomatic and military dealings. He was no longer a prop, he was an advisor, partner, arms wrapped around his waist from behind. He leaned back into the warmth of the chest he knew so well. "You're cold?" Silas murmured against his ear, his voice rough with sleep. "I like the cold," Julian replied, turning in his arms. Silas looked down at him, possessive and adoring. The viper who terrified the world was nothing but a devoted guardian within these walls. "Cassion was formally disowned yesterday," Silas mentioned casually. "Apparently, the Thorn family didn't appreciate the embarrassment." "I don't care about him," Julian said softly, reaching up to trace the sharp line of Silas's jaw. "I only care about where I am now." Silas smirked that dangerous, beautiful smile. "And where is that?" "Right where I belong." Julian pulled Silas down for a kiss that tasted of winter, ozone, and freedom. The world had called him broken. Silas had called him perfect. And looking into the amethyst eyes of the man who would burn the world for him, Julian finally believed it. And that is how the viper tamed the wolf, by finding the only creature on earth who wasn't afraid to be bitten. If you enjoyed seeing Silas destroy that engagement party, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments. Would you forgive a fiancé who insulted you to save face? Or would you leave him for the villain immediately? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then.